Okay, I thank the organizers of this conference. It's a great honor to be included in this panel of very eminent scholars, and especially an honor to be here celebrating the work of Joe LeDoux. I also thank the members of my lab who gathered the data that I'm going to be telling you about today. So I'm going to be talking about emotions. We see emotions in the face, as a number of speakers have pointed out. In fact, we see different emotions: joy, fear, anger, and so on. In other words, we divide the emotions into categories, and the question I've been interested in for many years is why these categories? Where do these categories come from? Where do they come from, for example, in the life of a child? And especially, could language play a role? I was intrigued by the theme of this conference, From the Humanities to Neuroscience and Back Again. The humanities, many people in linguistics, anthropology, and so on, have looked at language as a window onto emotions and have emphasized language differences. Neuroscience, for the most part, has instead thought of categories as universal, perhaps innate. And then I noticed in a chapter by Joe LeDoux the statement that language allows us to categorize and discriminate experiences. So this going back and forth seems to illustrate very nicely this going back and forth between the two. And I want to elaborate on this possibility of language playing a role in what categories we use to divide up the emotions. Linguists and anthropologists have pointed to cultural variations in emotion divisions, categories. So some cases they've emphasized are the Japanese word amai, which has no translation into English, at least no easy translation, no one-to-one, or the word fago from ifaluk has the same quality. But I want to point out that among us are human beings walking around every day who also have a different category system, namely children. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Here's a system for looking at children's categories. At the top is what I call labeling level. This is simply the number of categories that children use to divide up the emotions. So I'll come to this in detail a little bit later, but we show them, for example, facial expressions and ask them what emotion is this person feeling. And you can see up here some children use 0 labels, some use 1, 2, etc. No label. For those who use 1 label, almost always they use happy. For those who use 2 labels, some kids use happy and angry, some kids use happy and sad. Others use, there's a few who use something else, but that's rare. About a year later, on average, kids start using a 3-category system of happy, angry, and sad. Then fairly quickly they add another, either scared or surprised, and then they add the other one. So there's a 5-category system. And finally they add disgust. This is when they're looking at faces. Now, the different point of view from the one I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to contrast with this, is the idea of universal categories, which is mostly seen in the theory of emotion signaling. Famous current researchers, Paul Ekman, Carol Izard, who use a theory developed by Sylvan Tompkins in the 1960s. Your textbooks will tell you that Tompkins derived his theory from Charles Darwin, but that's mere propaganda. He actually got it from Floyd Allport, who wrote in the 1930s. When you read Charles Darwin, he has a theory that's nothing like what Tompkins and Ekman and Izard talk about. Their theory sees faces as very much like a lighthouse. It broadcasts a signal. This was a signal created by evolution, and so now is part of human nature. Notice that it's an altruistic broadcast in the sense of any witness out there, anybody who sees it gets the information. It has universal meaning and is probably shared with other species. And, importantly, there's universal recognition. There would be no point in sending out signals that aren't recognized. So recognition and broadcast or expression would have to co-evolve if they were to evolve at all. This is the theory of emotion signaling. As Ross Buck, another one of the researchers in this tradition, put it, the receiver has literally direct access to the motivational emotional state of the sender. So, let me look back here. This is my son expressing joy, fear, and anger. The question is, and we all see that, I think, the question is, does everyone see that? Well, here's the common task. Joe talked about this. He called it a multiple choice. If you see this face and you're asked to choose one of those labels, my guess is we would all agree that it's happy. So it doesn't allow for much subtlety, but there would be a lot of agreement. This is a forced choice. Here I'm presenting a meta-analysis of results from studies using this method with the Ekman-type faces. And as you can see, for the various facial expressions in different colors, for Western literate cultures, 20 different samples, everybody does very well. Close to 80% to well over 90%, depending on the facial expression. The next set is what happens when you go to non-Western cultures. So this is Japan, China, and so on. They're literate, but they're non-Western. Again, very high, but reliably lower than in Western cultures. So this seems to suggest there's some room for differences in categorization for the different emotions. Not so much for the different facial expressions. Now what happens when you go to illiterate cultures, ones that are far removed from Western influence? Here we only have 3 samples gathered by Ekman and his colleagues, but a noticeable drop, a little above chance, but and happy remains as high as in Western cultures, but for the other emotions, a substantial drop. So again, there seems to be a fair amount of room for cultural differences here. One question you might ask is, why is it that Americans and Western Europeans see these emotions so clearly? Here are the kind of facial expressions that are shown in these studies. They're very strong, exaggerated caricatures. If you might ask, do we see these in everyday life? Probably only in B movies. And the point is, these are all posed. They're posed with the purpose of expressing a single emotion to an audience in a recognizable fashion. What happens when we look at spontaneous expressions, things that people actually produce without posing? These are some children from the Foray group of Papua New Guinea, taken by Paul Ekman. As you can see, they're not so much subject to Western influence as we are in this room. So Paul had a camera, and he walked around taking pictures of people. Now, these people had never seen a camera before, and they had no idea what a camera does, so that's a great advantage. They just thought he was looking into this little box every once in a while, so they weren't paying too much attention. He also knew the situation they were in, what they were saying, what was happening, and he took lots of photographs. He published a book in 1980 with many of these photographs. Some of them, he said, express these universal emotions. So here are some of the facial expressions. So these are genuinely spontaneous expressions from the Foray. So the question is, do Westerners recognize these spontaneous expressions as well as they recognize those posed, exaggerated B-movie type things? And here are the results. In the orange bar, are when you show Boston College undergraduates the posed expression. So again, about 80% or more see the expected. But if you look at the green, this is the average score for the spontaneous expressions. A huge amount of drop and a huge amount of room for differences. The middle, this is a little technical, but this would be the maximum you could get, setting aside Ekman's prediction of what the emotion is, and just use consensus scoring, so the highest possible modal value. Now I want to turn to, after I've shaken your faith a little bit, I think, in facial expressions, as people have talked about, I want to turn to a developmental approach to look at our understanding of facial expressions and the role that language might play in it. First of all, let me talk about the implications of the facial signaling system for children's emotional categories. According to this theory, very explicitly, the emotional meaning of a facial signal is known early. We heard about social referencing, for example, where a child looks at the face of a caregiver and figures out what the emotion is. And the faces are then seeds around which semantic categories are supposed to form. From this theory, you can make certain predictions that infants understand facial signals, subject, of course, to maturation, visual maturation, and so forth, that young children use the same categories as do adults, happy, angry, disgust, etc., even if they're a little less reliable. And the faces are the earliest and most powerful cue to the categorization of the emotion of another. Let me illustrate this with disgust. Here, a very clear evolutionary story can be told for why children should understand facial expressions in this tradition. Long before they understand words, so you can tell a child, don't eat that, it's poisonous, you'll die, the parent can wrinkle the nose, express disgust at this, the child references, looks at that, says, I shouldn't eat it, or implicitly does that, doesn't eat it and survives. So a nice evolutionary story. The child can also learn through observational learning what's disgusting, what's not disgusting, and presumably avoid getting sick and so forth. So that's the story. The prediction is that children will understand the disgust phase and see it as disgust very early on. Okay. For this, I want to turn to a slightly different task than the multiple choice, free labeling. So you show a face one at a time, and you simply say, what does this person feel? This was the earliest task that researchers, now almost a century ago, started using. And here are the results of the first study by Georgina Gates that I've seen published. And these are children aged down here from 2 through 14. And these are their average scores across a large number of different facial expressions. What you can see is that kids are very poor at this task. And they improve, but only gradually. And so even teenagers are not up to an adult level. This was a rather surprising result. And these studies are old and primitive, but it's now been replicated a large number of times, including in our lab. So let's look at disgust. Georgina Gates didn't have a disgust expression, but others have. Oops. Okay. So here's data from our lab combined across a number of different studies. So the N for the different ages is slightly different. But if you ask, you show the child the Ekman disgust face and say, what is this? The number who say disgust is very small and increases very gradually, just as Georgina Gates found. On the other hand, if you look a little more carefully, what you find is that they do label it. They don't look at it with bewilderment. They do label it, they just get it wrong. At 2, they don't know much. They do look with some bewilderment. But by 3, the majority is labeling it anger. And that continues right on through 9. We've now done this up to early teens, and we get the same kind of result, although the number drops off. The number of kids labeling it anger drops off, and the number labeling it disgust starts to increase. But that's pretty late in life. So here are the kinds of data you get that I've already showed you, just with a bar graph, facial expressions, and in blue you see the adults doing quite well. Here are the children. Here I wanted to point out that they, even though on average they're doing rather poorly, they do differently with different facial expressions. So they do reasonably well with happy, angry, sad, but less so with scared and surprised, and dismally with disgust. This is free labeling. Let's look a little more closely. These are the green bars again with free labeling, facial expressions, and there's how kids do. These are preschoolers, age about 3 to 5. And this is, to get scored right, you have to say happy or angry or sad or some synonym. So angry could be cross or something like that. But if you score them for valence, so for happy they could say feels good, or for angry they could say almost any negative thing, feels bad, feels disgusted, feels scared, and so on. Then you see they do as well as adults. So kids do know something about these faces, they just don't know the specific categories that the adults use. They use valence, and they're quite good at valence. This is a different study, different method I did a large number of years ago with Mary Bullock. Here there were no words involved, so even though I use labels, those are actually facial expressions up there. This is a multidimensional scaling study of faces, and these are data from 2-year-olds. So here we showed them a face, and then we showed them a couple other faces, and we say, who feels like this person feels? And when you score that for similarity and use multidimensional scaling, where the closer things are, the more similar they are in the mind of the child, you see that over on your right are the more positive ones, and on the left the more negative ones. So they do see the disgust faces negative, along with anger and fear and sad, and the surprise, happy, excited, calm faces as positive. And these are 2-year-olds. So, to summarize so far, valence seems to develop early. It's part of the earliest labeling of facial expressions. And for example, the disgust face is labeled angry, correct as to valence, but not correct as to specific categories. So let me go back to the free labeling task. This is how we got this system that I told you about, but now I want you to memorize it, what all these numbers mean, the number of labels and which ones they are, because it'll be important for a later study I'll tell you about. We've now replicated that system. The one I showed you was for still faces, but we can also do it with video clips of dynamic faces, with dynamic full body voice and face, with dynamic without the face, so blur out the face and just see the body and the voice. Also, just telling them stories. So Sally came home one day and found that her fish had died. How does she feel? And so on. And we also do it with behavioral consequences. Tommy jumped up and down and hit his friend. How was he feeling? I found out recently that this was also replicated with the still faces with French-speaking Canadian children. Whether it replicates in other cultures and societies, we don't know. Now I want to turn to a different task that gets to some degree away from words, labels. And here we have a box. So we bring in a box to a child, and we say, this is a very special box. In this box goes the happy people, and everyone else goes out here, okay? Happy people in here, everyone else out here, and then we give them a photograph, and we say, does this person, should we put her in the box or put her out here? So it's a real simple choice. The child can either put it in the box or not. So getting close to a nonverbal response. Okay, so we then show them faces one at a time, unlabeled of course, but for 2-year-olds it wouldn't really matter too much. Put it in the box or not. Oops. And here are the results. You can see they put the smiling, happy face in the box most of the time, and they put the other faces outside the box. So this is the prediction. This supports the prediction that I would make with valence, but it also, of course, supports the category system, that they understand happy and leave out all the other categories. So now the question is, what about if we label the box angry? So again, we bring in a special box. This is for angry people. All the angry people go in here. Everyone else goes out there. Now what do kids do? Okay, well here you see they leave out the smiling face. And they do put in the angry face, but they also put in the sad face, the fear face, the disgust face. They're equally likely to put in any negative face. What this tends to say to us is their category at this stage is happy versus negative, or positive versus negative. And these are 2-year-olds. So, to summarize again, the box test replicates the valence effect. Their initial category is positive, negative. And interestingly, the word anger for children seems to cover all negative faces. So it doesn't mean the same thing for them as it does for us. Now here's an important question. What if we define the box by a facial expression? This is important for a number of reasons. You may have wondered, well, we're still using a label for the box, so it's still a verbal task to some degree, even though the child can physically make their response. It's also interesting because the emotion signaling theory predicts that the face, rather than the word, should be the more important and powerful cue. And then, so it raises the question, what is a powerful cue to a child? So we now do the same study. Here's one condition where the box is labeled by the word, angry, so I say here's a special box, it's for angry people, just like I already described. But in the other condition, we say, this box is for everybody who feels like this, and we show them a face, the Ekman angry face. Everyone else goes out there. By the way, notice they could solve this problem with simple perceptual matching. They don't have to do anything else, but if they understand the meaning of the face, this should be the more powerful condition. In fact, we get just the opposite. Repeatedly from 2-year-olds through 7-year-olds with anger and other boxes and so on, we've replicated this a large number of times, we get what we call a label superiority effect. They do much better with the label when the box is labeled by an emotion word than when the facial expression defines the box. Okay. We were wondering whether we could get this in other ways, so we had children tell us stories. They're not real good at this task, but if you lead them, so they just have to give a bit of the story, and then you give a bit of the story, and we go back and forth, they can tell you a story. So what we do here is we tell them a story. Sally lives in a house. What color will the house be? What's her pet's name? And so on, and they supply the story. And then we can say, one day, Sally was angry. What did she do next? She was so angry, everyone could tell she was angry. What did she do next? And then they have to say something. And then we have adults judge whether the behavioral consequence really fit anger or not. So that's one condition where anger, or we could where we use the word to define it, or we could show a picture. We could say, Sally felt like this, and we show the anger face, and then they tell the behavioral consequence. So which would be the more powerful condition? Well, as I suggested, this is for disgust, sorry, instead of anger, but you can see the disgust face we use. Kids do very poorly, about 10% will get the reasonable disgust response, tell a behavior or a cause, either one, but they do much better with the label. So this suggests that they are understanding the word, they're just not understanding the face. So let me summarize for you our results with disgust. I like this example because it's such a clear evolutionary story. Just happens not to be true. Given the disgust face, children know that it's negative. A majority, at least up to age 9, and we've now done this with early teens, label it anger instead of disgust. Children generate causes and consequences that are appropriate to anger, not to disgust when you show them this face. On the other hand, when you give them the word disgust, now they do understand the causes and the consequences. So they have started to develop the concept of disgust, but it's just centered around the word rather than around the face. So, to summarize the label superiority effect, children know the label years before they know the face. The label is superior to the face in invoking the category. The box task, when we define the box by a face, they do worse than when we define it by a label. And in the storytelling task, they tell stories that are much more accurate when it's based on the label than when it's based on the face. Now I want to describe my final study. So I thank you for your patience, in which I combine these two kinds of tasks that I've told you about so far. Part of it is free labeling. So we do free labeling one day, then we come back to the daycare a couple days later, and we do another part, namely the box task. And I'll present the results by putting down here on the abscissa the child's labeling level. So that's why I ask you to memorize it. There's a quiz at the end of the day. Down here, we could use age down there, but we get slightly more precise results by using labeling level. And then here on the ordinate, I'm going to tell you what they put in the box. So now I'm giving you the results from the box task. And I'll show you the anger box. So here's the results for the anger face and then for the smiling happy face. So what you see is that in the blue, even children who use no words put the angry face in the angry box. And they consistently do this. So these are largely 2-year-olds, and by labeling level 6, these are 5 going on 6. In any case, whatever vocabulary, they're all putting the angry face in the angry box. On the other hand, if you look at those at labeling level 0, these are very young kids, and they're putting the happy face in the angry box too. In fact, they put everything in the box. They'll start putting trash around and put it in the box. They just love to put things in boxes, so it doesn't mean very much. But notice that kids just a little bit older, these are 2s going on 3s, who have started to use the word happy, have begun using the word happy, so they're at labeling level 1. Now they very clearly differentiate between the faces that go in the angry box and the smiling face that they leave out. So they're now starting to differentiate. And by labeling level 2, they really do leave out the smile, and after that, they never put it in. So they're very good at this task at a very young age. Okay. Here I combine the sad faces and the happy and the fear faces because we get about the same results with the 2 of them. Again, the 2-year-olds put it in the angry box, but they put everything in the angry box. At labeling level 1, they're starting to differentiate, but not very well. When they start to labeling level 2A, which is those kids who use happy, angry as their vocabulary, they've started to differentiate a little more, and then they improve. But notice they never quite get perfect. Even though these same kids are leaving out the smile face, they never get perfect. So again, you can see kind of a residual of the valence effect. Now here's the interesting part. What about the disgust face? This is in the red dots. Labeling level 0, they put it in, but they put in everything. But labeling levels 1 through 5, they put in the disgust face in the angry box just as frequently as they put in an angry face. They do not differentiate at all. And it's not until they've started to use the word disgust that they start to make some differentiation between the two. And that happens at labeling level 6. So, to summarize what's going on with labels, the label is superior to the face in evoking the category. Category differentiate correlates with label acquisition. And the label seems to precede the face in their understanding. So, what does this tell us about language? Well, I have no strong data. I certainly have no causal data, but there's some correlational data here that are interesting. The categories that children use do correlate with label acquisition. even in nonverbal tasks. Label is superior to the face in evoking the category. Children know the meaning of the label even when they do not know the meaning of the face, meaning what adults think is the face. And the language then may be the seed around which anger and disgust, for example, are differentiated. So the label may be the way that culture communicates to the child that starts to form these categories rather than faces, at least for the category of disgust. So I come back to this quote that language allows us to categorize and discriminate experiences. Data with children seem to be consistent with that claim. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation by both speakers. Are there any questions? Yes.
My question is to Jim. What's your take, I may have missed it, on the experiment in which you show that Western children, subject can differentiate well in the exaggerated facial expression, but other cultures cannot. Is the meaning maybe that we lost the ability to really differentiate among facial expressions?
So the question is, what do we make of those data that I presented at the very beginning, where you get this strong cultural difference between Western cultures, non-Western cultures, and illiterate cultures? I don't think it's because we have the ability and we lose it. Certainly the data from children suggests that the ability to attach a label, to categorize emotions based on faces, is acquired very slowly. So my guess is it's not that we start with the ability and then lose it, but just the other way around, that in different cultures, you're taught at a different rate and taught a slightly different category system. It's not going to be completely different. Categories aren't completely arbitrary, but it'll end up being a slightly different system.
But non-Western cultures seem to be much better in differentiating small changes in facial expressions. That's what I got from the experiment.
That could be. It could be that, and certainly that's what we have with children. So one way to think about this is that as we do with color terminology, different languages differentiate more versus less. It may be that different languages differentiate among emotions more versus less. So somebody mentioned that English has many words for emotion. This seems to be true. Somebody counted more than 500 words for emotion in English, whereas anthropologists have talked about cultures that have no more than a handful of words for different emotions. So it may be that the degree of differentiation, and this is what you see with development, the degree of differentiation may vary a lot at the adult stage. It may start off very simple. I think it starts off with positive, negative. This seems to be something everybody needs to know, and then differentiates.
So last point that we can talk about it later. It seems to me one interpretation is that if I were in a non-Western society and would have seen these exaggerated faces, I've never seen them in my life.
Right.
Because people don't behave this way.
Right.
So it's sort of almost ridiculous for me to assign labels to that, maybe in theater. Whereas I see natural faces the way they really behave, and in Western society we seem to exaggerate.
Right. That's certainly a possibility, and that study should be done, but it hasn't been done. How do people in other cultures interpret spontaneous faces rather than these exaggerated ones? So ironically, the Ekman-Azar tradition based on Tompkins was that these facial expressions that they use are the ones that ought to be the clearest. But your point is maybe they're not the clearest. And that's certainly a possibility. Although Boston College kids looking at spontaneous facial expressions aren't recognizing them in the sense of attaching the Ekman label to them anywhere near the degree of consistency that Ekman would predict.
May I add something that may be interpreted as maybe pathology on my side? When I look at a picture that is used to display disgust, I don't see disgust there. I see anger. And the reason is probably a cultural influence. And, or the child in me.
Either that or you're below 9 years old.
Because you don't really see disgust this way in many societies.
Yeah. The face I showed you is the one that Tompkins proposed and it's the standard one. So in neuroscience studies, when they show a disgust face, that's the one they use. We call it the nose scrunch. There may be faces that kids or people in other cultures do recognize as disgust much earlier and better than the one that Tompkins used. For example, if you do a mouth gape and stick out your tongue like you're about to vomit, people recognize that. My guess is much earlier. When we have children tell us stories about the nose scrunch that I showed you, their stories are he's smelling something. And they sometimes think he's smelling something good. So they associate it with odors, not with disgust.
So a more general comment, and then I shut up. We tend to use in our experiments a very limited population of subjects. Most of what we know about the brain is probably related to a very limited population of subjects which we get at universities at a certain age and so on and so on. So it seems to me like these pictures that were determined or selected in the 30s in a very selected culture do not really generalize.
The history of the study of facial expressions was that the earliest studies done in the beginning of the 20th century had a variety of faces. The problem was, contrary to what everyone believed, people didn't agree on what they meant. So there was a kind of evolution where they started finding a few faces that people recognized, a few categories. They tried free labeling, that didn't work. So there was a kind of evolution where some faces worked, some words worked, some methods, the multiple choice worked, and when you combine all those things together, you start to get the results that are now in the textbooks. So it's a system that worked, but I think it's largely an artifact of method.
I have actually questions to both speakers. I will start with Jim because he's out on the spot. Thank you very much. It's for someone who actually does CBT with few-year-olds. It's a wonderful talk, very informative. Considering the fact that anger seems to be, or expression of anger seems to be developmentally the most significant, significantly recognized emotion by children. I wonder what it tells us about the evolution of human species. Whether this recognition of anger also applies to angry faces of animals, like predatorial animals, or animals that could be possibly predatorial, or it's human specific. So in other words, if this is human specific, that means that for whatever survival of a child, or the threat for survival of a child, lies within the human community that the child is raised in. So that's like one question, and I would...
Well, I'm not very good at telling evolutionary stories, and I don't know much about non-human species, but from the studies we've done with children, I think I can say a little bit about what you're asking. When children begin using the word anger, they associate it with a wide range of faces, not just the Ekman anger face, but with what he called the disgust face, the contempt face, fear face, some sad faces. So they see anger lots of places. And when they tell stories, they don't just tell the stereotype stories, but they tell quite a range. So our current hunch is that children are humans are a social group, and children are very sensitive to approval and disapproval from others. And when they use the word anger, I think they simply mean something very broad like disapproval from others. he's angry at me. And almost any negative facial expression will be interpreted that way. And it's only later that they come to narrow down to the more adult-like version.
Thank you. Now, a question for you, Liz. With these earlier studies of reconciliation, one of the big issues was the reconciliation versus extinction. Of course, we have Yadin's work and with the dominant trace. Now, your study shows that reconciliation and extinctions, they are really related in a very interesting way. So the question is, what do you think? Is it that reconciliation affects extinction, or it's extinction that affects reconciliation? If there is no answer to that question, so what will be the areas that either whatever temporal windows or brain areas, what are your thoughts? Where is that extinction and reconciliation somehow overlap, that it allows manipulation with one using another?
So I didn't talk about this very much here, but you, of course, have inside knowledge. I think they're completely different processes, right? So extinction, as typically done, creates a second memory trace, right? So extinction just simply tells you the information you get is this stimulus doesn't predict danger, right? It's safety learning. If it happens as it normally is done, now you've got two memory traces, right? The first memory trace, this blue square predicts shock. The second memory trace, this blue square predicts no shock. And those two are represented independently in the brain. But in our study, and we now have a brain imaging study that we've conducted, which is almost done, what we find, if that learning, it's just information about the value of the stimulus. If that learning happens during the time window when we think reconsolidation is occurring, and we know that only from the work in other species, right? What we get is a different storage process. Instead of now creating a second memory trace, that new information about the value of the stimulus gets incorporated into the first memory trace while it's being restored, right? And so in our brain imaging study, what we're seeing, and to me it's surprising because the process looks so very similar in what we're doing experimentally, right? But if we think about it in the information that you have and what the memories are then being created, they're very different. And what we actually see in our brain imaging study is this ventral medial prefrontal cortex region that we know is important in extinction learning it seems to be completely offline when we're doing standard extinction training while reconsolidation is occurring, right? That when we think it's occurring, right, during that time window. So this is all, again, hypotheses about what's happening in the brain based on studies that are not done in humans. So I think if we think about these things as what's the information and what's the memory trace, they are very, very different processes. The information, Yadin has a comment here, I can tell. He can barely sit. He's like that kid in the back. No, me. Good. Yeah. So I think they're very different processes, but the information we're giving is the same. But what's happening in the brain varies depending on the timing of the situation, and that what you end up with is very different. So that's what I think. Yadin.
So I think it's a very interesting point because it unveils the differences in the levels of analysis and what happens at every level. Because at the cellular level, if you assume that at least part of the circuit is shared, then at the cellular level, there is rather good evidence that you have competition between the two, which means that they compete for plasticity resources. This has been shown in vivo, this has been shown in vitro, and so on and so on. So I would be more cautious in saying that there are utterly different processes. Those are different tasks or different training protocols, but they are not different processes, because otherwise, if there were to be different processes, you wouldn't get what you get at the behavior level, because they seem to compete even in your studies.
In the
because if you have this window during which your training will influence the original trace versus creating the new one and a separate one, and so on and so on. This means that you have a window of opportunity in which you can change the plasticity resource, the plasticity or the connection or the synaptic connection within a given circuit that is relevant to that behavior. So they interact.
Yes. I didn't mean to imply that they don't.
No, I'm just claiming that the level of analysis is different. They are very different from the point of view of the protocol that we are using. We are using either extinction or
But you see,
else.
I mean, I think what Jacek is referring to, though, is that the protocol seems so very similar, right? And it's just a very subtle shift in timing, right? And so then the question becomes, where is it going so different?
So probably the difference, the big difference in that timing is that when you have an immediate, where the two traces or whatever is there are still active, they sort of compete. And they compete for the plasticity resources, which has been shown also in LTP by Tobias and others. And this allows you to get this difference. So they are not really different in terms of the cellular machinery. They are different in terms of the protocol that you use, in the behavioral protocol.
They're different. I mean, there's going to be a difference in the cellular machinery, I mean, I don't think we completely understand what that is yet, right?
Sorry?
There's got to be some difference, right, that's resulting in the difference of behavior.
This is the competition between which trace is going to be which trace is stronger at that point in time, which changes over time.
Yes.
So this will allow you to get one behavioral outcome under these conditions and another behavioral outcome.
I think we're talking past each other a little bit. Anyways, I don't know if we answered your question at all.
Jim, just a quick clarification point. I thought you had that your data showed that under free viewing conditions or free naming conditions, adults were not as good as they were under the multiple choice.
For sure, that's true.
Oh, because it looked like they were always high in your graph there.
In the very first graphs I was showing was multiple choice. And eventually, if you simplify the task enough and you keep repeating, you can get even free labeling to start rising. It never rises to the level of forced choice, but it can get up pretty high the more you narrow the task for them. Eventually, human beings catch on to what you're asking.
Right. Then I had a question about the very young children and their judging of the faces. You think they'd be any better if they were judging their own mother? I mean, if you have like a novel face, that can induce anxiety and other things that might compete with the process.
We've tried, well, I don't know, is the bottom line. We've tried thinking, well, maybe if they saw faces of other children rather than, so we do have maybe a preteen that we've used that we get no difference. We've tried finding kids who are able to do facial expressions. Shirley Temple was just an anomaly. Kids don't make good actors for the most part, but we haven't tried the mother. For the most part, people are terrible at making these expressions, so we haven't done that. It's a great.
Even the blonde woman who was doing it looked sort of happy when she was discussing it.
Beck.
I have one question to Professor Russell. I was just wondering, because maybe it's childish, maybe my brain is childlike, because I don't recognize, I don't see the difference between anger and disgust. And I was just wondering, because the strongest controversies were among those two feelings, and in general, kids don't see disgust as a feeling, especially at the beginning when they just feel emotions, but they don't have the category of language because they are too young. I mean, I was just wondering, as a philosopher and a mother of two kids, while observing them when they're very small, I mean, maybe there's nothing like disgust in general. Maybe disgust is just a feeling which is artificially created by society. I don't know, in the process of socialization, because also that there were the strongest differences between the Western cultures and the others, and we as people, especially in Western cultures, are trained to feel disgust among the feelings that in other cultures are not disgusting. I mean, for example, when I observe my kids, they touch snails with pleasure, and there's nothing disgusting in that at all. And also, when we are older, we think that very often bacteria or something, because in Western cultures we live in, let's say, sterilized world, where many things like being dirty or, I don't know, being ill, or things like, I don't know, dying or I mean, death or other things are disgusting for us. I mean, can it be like that, that the feeling of disgust is the feeling which is like half, I don't know, somehow artificially created by society in the process of socialization? I was just wondering like that, because there were those controversies that are quite big.
Well, certainly that's kind of one of the major questions in the psychology of emotion. Where do these categories come from? Where do those conscious experiences come from? Where do different kinds of emotions come from? I was trying to raise doubts about the dominant theory that you find in your textbooks, that there are these basic emotions that are inherited, that are common to many species and so on. Whether we can also, whether you want to go to another extreme where it's completely cultural artifacts is a somewhat different question. It does seem to me that that's a rather extreme version, and that there's going to be some combination of the two. So positive, negative seems something that everybody needs to know, but how you differentiate anger, contempt, and so forth may be a cultural kind of training that you need. But I don't think we know exactly where on that continuum it falls. There was one point you made, though, that I wanted to at least make more problematic, and that is, I'm not sure that children have all these feelings that they just haven't learned how to label. It may be that feelings are also something that's very amorphous, and we need to learn how to differentiate among those, that there is kind of an almost infinite variety of feeling states, that because of context and plans and motivations and all kinds of things, and that we need to learn how to categorize those as well. But anyway, that's a view that I have.
Well, thank you very much, both speakers. It's time for a coffee break, and I'm sure both speakers can address those additional questions during the break.
Thank you.
Thank you.